The Department of Community and Cultural Affairs presents Emancipation Commemoration 2020, inaugural Mary Prince Day, Mary Prince and the Struggle for Freedom by Dr. Clarence V.H. Maxwell.
The woman and the man probably planned this for several days. The man was Thomas Pringle, a poet and a secretary for the Abolitionist Society in London, a Scotsman who had lived in South Africa. The woman was a Black Bermudian who had recently walked away from her owners and secured employment in the Pringle household. She was about Pringle's age, but probably looked older, strafed with old keloid scars, racked by rheumatism, her eyesight poor at best. This woman was called Molly James, Molly Wood, or just Molly or Mary. But she took the name that became her nom de guerre, the name that she's known in history, Mary Prince. Her plan was to publish her experiences as an enslaved woman, and their plan was to insert it into the raging abolition debate in 1828, just as they were moving towards political changes in London. To that end, they secured the services of Pringle's mentee, a young poet living in his house named Susanna Strickland. Prince would tell Strickland her story, Strickland would transcribe it, Pringle would edit it. The purpose of the story, told verbatim by a formerly enslaved woman, the first in British literature, was to pressure the government to accelerate the end of slavery, the last major act in the humanitarian revolution. The book became known as The History of Mary Prince. Pringle's narrative became part of the weaponry of the humanitarian revolution that sought to put an end to chattel enslavement. We shall discuss Mary Prince and her struggle. We shall begin with the context, what she sought to struggle against. The first enslaved people arrived in Bermuda in 1616 aboard the Edward from Venezuela, making Bermuda the earliest society with slaves in the British Atlantic. One was Black, the other was Indian, both were pearl divers. As England, unlike the Iberian empires, did not have a legal infrastructure governing the slavery of people, each colony had to construct its own infrastructural system. For Bermuda, this began very early, with the Act to Restrain the Insolences of the Negroes passed in 1623. By 1680, Bermuda had become a fully fledged slave society with laws, customs, and practices for the purpose of regulating slaves. This meant the emergence of a race-based caste system. And this is clear in the oft-used legal formula in the legislation of the period, at least up until 1764. That came under the phrase Negroes and other slaves. Significant evolution occurred in 1764 in the wake of the conspiracy crisis of 1761, and this became the Act for the Better Government of Negroes, Mulattoes, and Indians, Bond and Free. This created a raft of laws to control not just slaves, but free people, free Blacks, free people of color, and free Native Americans. It also defined who was legally Black, colored, or Native American in the law, a person descendant of a white man. These laws, a person who's not descendant of a white man. These laws were revised with the Amelioration Act, which removed much of the harsh punishments of the 1764 Act and lessened the racist restrictions and added the certificate of good character. This latter would give Blacks the opportunity to present themselves in court and give evidence in court. Mary Prince was born into this world in 1788 in Devonshire. Before she walked to freedom from her family, from the Wood family, several people had owned her in 3 different regions: Bermuda, Turks Island, and Antigua. The last one, Antigua became her home, and there she would marry a carpenter, Daniel James. Mary Prince wanted more for herself. To this end, she joined their Moravian church, and while there used this relationship to improve her literacy. This would be an important tool in her arsenal yet several years later. That later occurred when she left the woods and became fully enmeshed in the abolitionist movement in London. While in London, she more than likely read the narratives of men like Olaudah Equiano and Assas. And it was probably from this that she decided that she should contribute her story to the discussion. To that end, she mentioned it to Pringle as an idea, since she was working in his household. Pringle, perfect person to mention it, as secretary of the Abolition Society, thought this was a good idea. And the result of the course was the construction of a partnership that would ultimately result in the history of Mary Prince. What emerged was a first-hand account of the treatment that she received while she was enslaved. She began with her childhood, as she put it, with a child's understanding of her situation. This abruptly ended when her mother was asked to take her and her siblings to Hamilton to be sold at the public vending. This provided the first major discussion for her of one of the more harrowing aspects of slavery, splitting up of families and the selling of children. An event that caused her mother considerable distress. And Mary Prince in her recollection. It also began her discussion of her life under the first of her subsequent illness. The head punches, the whippings, and the brutal scourgings that happened to a girl in her early teens. She also used the narrative to discuss later on the plight of free people, and she puts it in her marriage to Daniel James. Their otherwise happy marriage was ruined by the conditions of enslavement, something that would have appealed to the abolitionists in London, who were particularly from a religious bent. But the history of Mary Prince was part of a strategy carried out not just by her, but also by other enslaved people. A technique in which they would take the power of the powerful allies and use it against the slaveocracy. A sort of a Nancy strategy. This use of a sort of a Nancy strategy would mean that metropolitan involvement was crucial leverage in her encounter against colonial slaveocracy. These allies, in this alliance embodied in her partnership with Pringle and Strickland, was what would push the narrative. This was expressly stated by the narrative herself. Oh, the horrors of slavery. How the thought of it pains my heart. But the truth of it ought to be told. And what my eyes have seen, I think is my duty to relate. For few people in England know what slavery is. I've been a slave. I have felt what a slave feels, and I know what a slave knows. And I would have all the good people in England to know it too, that they may break our chains and set us free. On August 28, 1833, the Emancipation Act was promulgated. As a concession to the British colonial system, each assembly was to pass its own Abolition Act, amending the Emancipation Act, Parliament. On the 10th of February, 1834, the Bermuda House of Assembly passed two Abolition Acts to come into effect on the 1st of August, 1834. Abolition Act 2 ended all civil disabilities based on race that had begun as early as 1623 with Act restrained instances of Negroes. Abolition Act 1 ended slavery, perhaps as a providential tribute to Mary Prince, or Providence's tribute to Mary Prince. Both the Antigua and Bermuda would abolish slavery outright and not adopt an apprenticeship system. Both of those places were final homes. As she had hoped, slavery was done up forevermore. Mary Prince had become acquainted with the abolitionist movement when she joined it and after her arrival in the Pringle household. She became acquainted with its literature, and she became acquainted with its actors. And she decided to become involved in it. She went from a desire to become, from manumission to desire for outright abolition, not just for herself, but for the entire Atlantic world, to become part of a process through which slavery will be done up forevermore for everybody, and ultimately bring about a new era post-1834. That is her major contribution to this particular debate. For the construction of a new era, she went to become an international hero, who was also a Bermuda hero. Happy Mary Prince Day.
Thank you for watching Mary Prince and the Struggle for Freedom, written by Dr. Clarence V.H. Maxwell, a presentation of the Department of Community and Cultural Affairs.